Now I'm going to do the usual caveat here. The abstract I submitted for this particular talk actually belonged to a version of the talk I gave at the New Zealand Association of Philosophy back in December. And due to some very good comments both by Charles Pigden and Vanya Kovac, I tried to integrate those into the paper I wrote, and then had to rewrite a few other sections to accommodate those changes, and effectively have written a brand new paper in the course of 1 week. So the promise bit at the end, where I talk about norms and how norms actually affect the notion of fake news and accusations of fake news, no longer occurs within the scope of this particular paper. This is a completely new paper. But luckily, our colleague Joe has read it. He says it's great. So basically, I don't think I even need to present it now. We should just go upstairs now and have a few drinks, because Joe has given it his endorsement. And frankly, it would just be a waste of all of our time for me to present it now. Except instead, I'm going to start off with a small clip.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake.
No, apparently not. There was meant to be a small clip of Donald Trump there talking about fake news. So, fake news appears to be a problem in search of a cure, at least according to underclass. There's a lot of fake news out there. There's a lot of concern that people are making accusations of fake news, which turn out to be insincere. And fake news appears to be a new label for an age-old problem. Although, arguably, actually the problem has been going on as long as there has been professional production of news in the world. And this particular image here actually dates back from 1894. So the label fake news actually has a very long history, even though for some of us, it appears to be a label which has appeared very recently in contemporary political discourse. Now, there are two issues at stake when we talk about fake news. There is the case of what is fake news, so how do we work out what news is fake in the world? And then there's the concern that there are some insincere actors out there who are going around labeling actual news as being fake news. Now, as a philosopher, I'm of the firm opinion that we need to get to grips with what fake news is first, before we can start talking about what's happening when people accuse things of being fake news, because we need to know what we're talking about before we can understand how the accusations work, which is why we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about fake news, what fake news is, and then what fake news isn't, in order to come to an understanding of exactly how the accusation that is fake news works. And so I want to start our discussion of what is fake news with a rather interesting bit of local history. According to the Daily Southern Cross, on February the 17th, 1873, a Russian ironclad, the Kaskowski, was moored in the Waikato harbour and was holding Auckland City to ransom. This was reported in one of the major periodicals in Auckland at the time. Now, of course, if you know your history, you'll be aware that there is no record of there being a Russian invasion in this country back in 1873. So I put it to you that either there has been a cover-up of a foreign nation taking over this country over 100 years ago, bringing in some kind of proto-communism before we were even aware of it, or this story is fake. And indeed, it was. The editor of the Daily Southern Cross, one David Lucky, was concerned about two issues. One, the British Navy was nowhere to be found in the Pacific in the 1870s. So he was concerned that if there was a move by Imperial Russia to try and take over this part of the world, something which Russia had its eyes upon, the British Navy would not be able to come and rescue us, because they were nowhere to be found, and Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand had no naval force of its own at the time. So we were defenceless. Lucky was also concerned that the Auckland Council was nepotistic and was also embezzling large sums of money. And so the news story goes to quite some length to point out that when the Russians hold Auckland Council to ransom and demand all the gold in their coffers, the coffers empty. Now, this is a story that was a piece of news which was fake, but I put it not actually fake news, because Lucky goes to quite some lengths to make anyone who's reading the Daily Southern Cross aware that they should not treat this as reported fact. The Russian ironclad is called the cask of whiskey, the cask of whiskey, which is a knowing joke by the Scottish editor of the paper that the name of the ship is not a Russian ship at all. The date of the event being reported occurred 3 months prior, so it occurs at the end of 1872. And the name of several councillors and the mayor of Auckland at the time turn out to be fake. Any attentive reader of the article, I mean, Lucky even goes to the point of putting asterisks around the dates in the article to draw attention to the fact it is not occurring in real time. So this is an example of a deliberate deception. So David Lucky, as editor of the paper, has put a false story into his newspaper. He has a target audience, a set of people he wants to persuade of some particular claim. In this case, he wants to persuade people that A, the British are not here to defend us in our time of need, and B, don't trust the Auckland Council in any way, shape or form, which you might say is a moral that people should have been listening to for a long time to this very day. But Lucky did not mean anyone to take this as being a factual news story. He goes out of his way to ensure that people know this is a hoax. Now, what's interesting about this is that there are several newspaper reports from around the country outside of Auckland indicating that people believed the hoax at the time, but due to the provincial nature of New Zealand society back in the 1870s and the fierce competition in our media landscape at the time, it's actually also not clear that these reports are genuine. These reports actually might have been making fun of Aucklanders, because of course they're the kind of people who would believe a Russian warship had invaded the harbour at the time. It's actually quite worth looking into this particular story. It's actually even more amazing than what I'm presenting here. So this is a story which is fake, but not, I contest, a story which is fake news. And that's because fake news is the deliberate presentation of typically false, or at least misleading claims as news, where the claims are misleading by design. So it's the idea you're trying to persuade some target audience to believe something that is false, which is not what Lucky was doing. He was not trying to persuade you that Russians were invading. He was simply trying to persuade you that if the Russians had invaded, look at what the consequences would be, and also would reveal the fact the council was embezzling all its funds at the time. And this definition comes out of the work of Axel Galfit, who's written quite a lot on fake news, testimony, and other related issues, and is kind of the operating definition that seems to be in the literature at this time. It's very much in line with this work here, so there has been a burst of work on fake news in recent years, including my own work back in 2017 and 2018. But I take it that Galfit's definition is the one we should work with, because Galfit does a number of things which are actually particularly important when it comes to the discussion of what fake news is and what fake news isn't. Galfit's definition is the superior of all the ones on offer because he has a very strict focus in his definition that fake news must be presented as being news. Part of the thing that makes fake news is that the producer of fake news is going out of their way to present their story as news, often by aping the format of news. Now, for those of you who have the misfortune of reading the Herald online, you'll be aware that when the Herald has a sponsored story, they make sure the sponsored story uses a different font and different page pagination to ensure that the story does not resemble news reporting. So they're going, look, this is in a newspaper, but you're not meant to take Ashley Church's most recent diatribe as to why landlords are the most predated upon part of the population in this country seriously, because they've given him a slightly different font and kerning, which means it's not news, its opinion which actually Church wants you to take as being news, but as a responsible newspaper, even though we're publishing it, we're not going to make you think it is news. It has all these features that make the presentation non-newsy. Gelford also points out that fake news tends to get its power by referring to real events in the world and to real people in the world. Fake news is very rarely entirely false. It will contain falsehoods, or it might be misleading by design by omitting salient factors. But when it comes to something being fake news, you tend to get fake news about real events in the world as opposed to other types of events. So whilst it's conceivable, you might get fake news about Bigfoot, Elvis, and UFOs. For it to work as fake news, it needs to be making reference to events or real people here and now. So a Bigfoot story which takes place in a fictional place at a distant point in time, featuring no real people, is not likely to be treated as news. A story that Justine witnessed Bigfoot in the back of her allotment might be, although we might get onto that. Actually, we'll be getting onto Justine and Bigfoot sightings later on. But exactly how, although, I mean, if Justine wants to bring that up in question time, that's fine. I won't tell her story about Bigfoot. I'm also now putting you on the spot by kind of implicating you have one. Maybe you do. Well, that's what I want to hear. So fake news stories tend to have elements which place them in the real world and make them contextualized such that we imagine they could occur, which of course is what you want from a fake news story. You want a story where people are going to go, that could have occurred. That's part of the, I can't say, the similitude? So I have speech disfluency, so there are certain words I think I know in my brain but can't actually say out loud. It has the kind of representation-iness of the real world. That's verisimilitude? Verisimilitude? See, now no one can say it. It's fine. So the deceptive element of what counts as fake news is either you introduce some falsehoods into the story, or you manipulate the story in some way to ensure that it points in a particular direction, which may be pointing people away from what actually happened. Now, one useful way to talk about fake news is to talk about what doesn't count as fake news, particularly with respect to news production. And this is important because in the definition to fake news, some people conflate things that I don't think should actually be considered as fake news under the umbrella term. For example, both Neil Levy and Ian Riley want to say that part of the story of fake news also includes sloppy reporting or bad journalism, whereby you might get a situation where people fail to engage in fact checks or get some information wrong. And they go, look, this is part of the story of news which is fake because there are now falsehoods in the story being told. Thus, it counts as fake news. Now, there are a whole bunch of socio-economic rationales as to why bad reporting occurs within our current media landscape. You've got the fact that we have too few journalists for the amount of news that needs to be produced. We have a need to rush to print, which often means you want to get a story out as quickly as possible. Sometimes getting a story out as quickly as possible will generate a very large number of alternative or conspiracy theories about the count. One of the big issues, because I do work on conspiracy theory as well, you have when dealing with accounts of 9/11, in the rush to get stories out about what happened on September 11th, 2001, there was a lack of fact-checking in the initial hours of the event. This is now part of the public record. Certain conspiracy theorists have jumped on this as evidence of there being a large-level conspiracy operating in the background. There are a whole bunch of rationales as to why bad reporting occurs, but bad reporting isn't typically going to be intentional. Most of the time, bad reporting occurs because of socio or economic issues in the media landscape, which means that it's not that people are deliberately choosing to produce bad news, but rather you've got aspects of news production that means mistakes are being made. Now, of course, any conspiracy theorist worth their salt to say, well, that's precisely what they want you to believe. And in some cases, that might be true. In the fuller version of this paper, I talk about how you might be concerned about patterns of production. A journalistic avenue that gets some things wrong occasionally, you might simply go, well, they're sloppy, and that's bad. Sloppy reporting is always going to be bad news. But a organization which routinely gets things wrong and blames it on bad mechanisms within their organization is the kind of organization you might go, I think you might be using that as the cover story for actually what you're doing here. You're claiming we're just being sloppy, but actually we're not. But if we take it that sloppy journalism simply is accidental introduction to falsehoods or misleading news stories, I don't think that counts as fake news, because fake news requires deliberate deception. It requires the producer to actually know that they are trying to present a false or misleading story as the news, as opposed to, say, rushing to print. And of course that gets us on to biased news. And biased news, of course, is a very big issue in certain media landscapes. And I want to say certain media landscapes because it kind of depends on how diverse your media landscape is. In this country, we really only have one newspaper of record, which is the New Zealand Herald. There are other smaller newspapers, like the Dominion in Wellington and the Press down in Christchurch, but they are not big papers. The only big paper we have is the Herald. In the same respect, we only have two major news networks producing things on TV, TVNZ1, or Channel 1 as we used to call it back in the day, and TV3, whilst in other nation states you have very diverse media landscapes, which is why you'll get the fight between MSNBC, CNN, Fox, and all those other organizations in the US. The diversity there is quite huge. And of course, what we see particularly in the US is that everyone claims that the news network the other person listens to is clearly biased in their reporting about things. Fox appears to absolutely love Donald Trump. CNN reportedly apparently hates him. This apparently is biased. But bias is also not necessarily deliberate deception. And there's quite a lot of work on exactly how bias works in the media landscape. Some of it actually cages off the work of Noam Chomsky with respect to institutional analysis, which basically goes, in many respects, when people produce news, they are actually producing news to an agenda despite what we might like to think. And sometimes that agenda is overt. At this news station, we don't report on X. And sometimes it's quite implicit. My boss doesn't like it when I report on issues of this particular kind, so I'm simply not going to put that up the chain. And indeed, this has been one of the arguments as to why Fox has a right-wing bias. It's not necessarily because the reporters and the editors are right-wing themselves, but rather the Murdoch family that owns the Fox network are the people who call the final shots as to who gets promoted or who gets demoted. And when you're concerned about job security, particularly in the States, you might only end up writing news stories that you know are going to get you noticed for a promotion round, rather than news stories that might make your life more difficult at the next board meeting. And so bias is not necessarily going to be fake news, because once again, there's a whole bunch of reasons as to why news can be biased that doesn't require any form of deliberate deception. But what is interesting is that biased news might lead to the production of fake news over time if your bias becomes untenable. Because eventually you might discover that despite the fact that your boss is of the firm opinion that anthropogenic climate change is not occurring, evidence is kind of mounting up that it is. At which point you're going, we're actually finding it very difficult to report that everything is fine, So now we might have to produce an occasionally misleading news story, or maybe we'll promote someone who isn't an expert as being an expert, and maybe we'll make up some stats over here to support this claim just once. And then with time you discover that you've gone from being a biased news network to a network that requires the production of fake news to maintain the appearance of that bias. So biased news might well lead to fake news and may be part of the causative story as to why fake news is endemic in particular news production systems. But biased news is not itself fake news, even though it might lead to it. Martin Hurst and Ian Riley also think that satirical news counts as fake news. And part of this is historical. The modern parlance of fake news actually comes out of work like The Daily Show and the like, who proudly promoted themselves as being fake news or fake news networks. But I think the problem here is that actually we've moved on from that particular labeling practice of satirists making fun of the news to a discussion of an actual phenomenon in the world, news which happens to be fake and is deliberate misrepresentation. So it would be a mistake to actually think that just because someone mistakes satire for news, they've been taken in by some piece of fake news. And that's because satire always has a target audience. If I'm producing satire, I am producing some kind of satirical joke story that my target audience is going to get. So people who read The Onion because they enjoy the kind of satirical comedy that they produce. It is possible for someone to come across The Onion by accident and then read it as serious news reporting, but they are not the target audience of satire. They are an accidental target. The fact that people aren't able to spot satire as satire doesn't make satirical news fake news, because once again, it's not a deliberate representation of a falsehood to a target audience here. Satire is aimed at people who enjoy satire. Some people may get the wrong message. Okay, now I'm going to use a naughty word. What about bullshit? So, bullshit, in the Frankfurtian sense, is the case of someone who engages in a speech act intended to persuade some target audience that they believe something regardless of the truth of that particular claim. Bullshitters are not necessarily going to be liars, because bullshitters don't care. They just don't care. They just want to say whatever they like. They don't care about the truth or falsity of the claim. Most of the time when we call someone on their bullshit, it's because they've said something patently ridiculous, and they end up shrugging it off. Yes, what are you going to do? And there is a concern that some news is bullshit. That there might be people out there who are producing news stories where they just don't care whatsoever about the content of those stories. Now, I say some people, there is some evidence out there that there are in fact bots which are engaging in this particular kind of behavior. Due to the way that we're so reliant on machine learning and algorithm now, we have songs being made by machines, creepy videos for children, which are animated, being made by machines, novels being written by machines. Presumably soon the next MCU universe film will be directed and starring machines. And also news being produced by bots, which is meant to aid the production of news and look like news, but the bots themselves just don't care. So some of this, and I mean this might also happen with actual human beings, it's slightly harder to imagine someone who goes to the effort of producing a news outlet who doesn't actually care about what they're printing there. Seems unusual to be a bullshit news producer. Although, maybe there are. Who here is aware of Alex Jones, the famous, Alex Jones, who talks like this and tries to sell you nano silver, who just got arrested on a drink driving charge in Texas just last night, US time. Interesting man. you might claim he's a bullshitter, because Alex Jones seems to be someone who is remarkably inconsistent or not caring about the truth of any claim he makes. Although actually it might be the case that Alex Jones is not a bullshitter, for the sheer fact that Alex Jones might be someone who just is a very bad epistemologist. He just doesn't understand how to weigh evidence, or when it's appropriate to change his mind about things, and simply read something online, go, well, that must be true, I'm going to write a news report about that now, put it online, and then put out a contradictory report 5 minutes later, and not be in any way aware that actually he's just made 2 contradictory claims before breakfast. It's not actually clear that Alex Jones is a bullshitter for the sheer fact that it's not actually quite clear that Alex Jones has any idea of what he's doing. And putting onto him the intentional state that he just doesn't care actually seems like a much more charitable claim to what he's actually doing, which is someone who is supremely confused about everything and doesn't know how to sort good ideas from bad ideas, fact from fiction, and the like. Possibly a better example of what actually might have been an example of a bullshit news producer is the Victorian periodical The Illustrated Police News. So this was a periodical that was being printed between about the 1890s and the early 20th century. It was called The Illustrated Police News. It had nothing to do with the police themselves. It was simply a gazette that reported on interesting and unusual crimes going on in the UK. About half the stories were true crime reporting, written up in the most salacious way possible, but cases of people breaking into people's bedrooms, sisters killing their brothers, husbands killing their wives, the whole shebang. About half of the remaining stories were embellished to make the stories seem better, and then about a quarter of the stories were entirely bullshit. They were simply stories that were written to get Victorians to buy another issue of the Illustrated Police Gazette. And there is some hypotheses that certain stories like Spring Hill Jack and the like all kind of originate in publications of particular kind, which, because they were mixed in with true crime reporting, meant that some people actually treated these stories as true, whilst also it seems to be the case that many readers of the Illustrated Police News knew that a quarter of the stories they were reading were bullshit, but they were also the best stories, which is why they came back the next week to buy another copy of the magazine. Because who doesn't want to read a story about someone's spouse who turned into a werewolf on their wedding night? That's a true crime story that is for the ages. But of course, the thing about bullshit is that bullshitters don't care about the truth. They literally don't care. Whilst fake news producers actually do. They're typically lying about something or trying to lead you away from some other thing. Their target audience are people they want to persuade to believe something with respect to something else. Which is why we're now going to talk about trolling. Trolling is an activity. We often think of it as an online activity, but trolling's been going on since time immemorial, where you want to give someone the impression that you believe some typically extraordinary claim to get a reaction from the target audience. So, for example, I might decide that I am going to troll Dan, that I am the best communist in the world and support that with quotes from Ayn Rand. And I keep on saying, as Ayn Rand says about the working class. And Dan gets more and more riled as I make this claim. Ayn Rand was a libertarian and an anti-communist. Well, no, but you can't be an anti-communist. I mean, I'm a communist. And here's another quote from Ayn Rand showing how good communism is. Now, obviously, I'm trolling Dan at this particular point in time. Dan is getting more and more annoyed, and the rest of the audience is laughing along with me because they recognize that I don't actually believe Ayn Rand was the best communist of all time, or that you can use Ayn Rand quotes to support communism. They just know that I'm being insincere somehow. It may turn out that I am a fervent communist and simply trolling by using Ayn Rand, or maybe I'm a libertarian and I'm just trying to make fun of communism through this particular thing. but as an audience, you are aware that I'm trolling them. So trolls care about reactions. Bullshitters technically don't. Bullshitters are simply enjoying the act of bullshitting. Trolls actually want to target an audience, and they want another audience to be laughing along with them. So trolling has two target audiences. The person you're trying to persuade that you believe some radical claim, even though you probably don't, and the audience which is laughing along with you, who are in on the joke. So yeah, we've got our two audiences there, and the intentions of the troll tend to differ from target audience. I want to rile Dan. What I want you to do is to appreciate that I'm actually having a joke at Dan's expense. This is related to my next rude word, shitposting. Now, shitposting is largely an online activity, and shitposting is a very special kind of trolling where you are trying to derail a conversation through your shitposting. So you're trying to engage, usually with really poor reasoning. So you want to actually try to make your shitpost incredibly obvious in such a way that the target audience, the people you want to rile or derail the conversation from, will get bogged down in the details of what you're saying, thus preventing more productive conversations from ever happening. And shitposters are very much keen, like trolls, because they are a special kind of troll, that the people you're trying to derail should be derailed and persuade them to stop having productive conversations, and the people who know you're shitposting should be getting a lot of enjoyment out of the act of shitposting that's going on. So shitposting is a very special form of trolling, and once again, there are two target audiences going on with that particular story. Now, my contention is, and the reason why we've talked about trolling, shitposting, bullshit, and lies, is that actually when we talk about the target audience of fake news, we should actually be talking about the target audiences of fake news. Because fake news producers tend to have two targets in mind when they are producing fake news. They have the in-group, the people they want to persuade this particular false or misleading story is news, and the out-group, the people they know are going to react to your fake news with the accusation that's just fake news. And fake news accusers, I should say insincere fake news accusers, also think in the same way. When someone is making an insincere allegation that something is fake news, then they tend, in that particular kind of situation, to be thinking about the people they want to persuade some actual news story is fake news, and how the people who know it's news is going to react to that insincere allegation. Now, it's important to note that this doesn't make things different from the way the news itself actually works. News typically has multiple target audiences, in that when you are someone who reads the news, listens to the news, or consumes the news, you tend to be the kind of person who thinks that reading, consuming, or enjoying the news is important. So you're someone who wants adequate reporting of the world. And in many situations, you're also the kind of person who wants to be more informed about events than some other part of the world. So as a news consumer, you of course want to be more informed by people who don't consume news. But also in many situations, and this applies more in cultures where you've got a lot of different competing news elements, you want to be the kind of person who's more informed about events of the world than the people who read that other newspaper. And actually, one of the best summations of this comes from the classic British sitcom, Yes, Minister. Now, given my audio didn't work the last time, this
Don't
may
tell
not
me
work
about the press.
either.
I know
Find it.
exactly who reads the
No, apparently.
Don't tell me about the press. I know exactly who reads the papers. Daily Mirror is read by people who think they run the country. The Guardian is read by people who think they ought to run the country. The Times is read by the people who actually do run the country. Daily Mail is read by the wives of the people who run the country. Financial Times is read by people who own the country. The Morning Star is read by people who think the country ought to be run by another country. The Daily Telegraph is read by people who think it is.
Historically, news media has targeted itself towards particular people on political, cultural, or socio-economic divides. And so it's not surprising that fake news would also operate in that particular way as well. So the news has targeted all audiences in a plural sense in the same way that fake news does. And of course, the producers and consumers of fake news are very much aware of this, because fake news producers typically react to people saying that's just fake news as going, well, look, that's just obvious that they're against us, and what we're reporting is true. So fake news producers often use the accusation that you're just producing fake news as evidence to their in-group that actually what they're reading is news, because otherwise, why would people be drawing attention to how wrong this is unless they're scared of what we've got to say? And consumers often act the same way. Consumers of fake news will take the rejection of their news by members of the out-group as being pretty good evidence that actually what they're consuming must be true after all. And this, to a certain extent, actually reflects how people treat the proper news. In a situation where you have a lot of different competing news networks or news producers, when you have fights between those news producers will use evidence of those fights, then they go, well, look, they can't attack us on the facts. That's why they refer to us as being fake news, or they refer to us as being misleading. They're just engaging in ad hominem attacks upon us. Doesn't that show that actually what we're producing is true after all? So I'd say that it's not just enough to say that fake news is deceptive to a target audience, because we need to be thinking about in-group target audiences and out-group target audiences when we consider what counts as fake news, and how the accusation that something is fake news often is weaponized in political debate. So, as we come towards the end of the talk, not every allegation is born equal. So that, as you may be aware, is President Donald J. Trump. He makes a lot of claims that news is fake and gets treated much more seriously when he makes those claims than other people in our society do when they make the same claim. So if you think about, say, Alex Jones making claims that some rival network, because Alex Jones does run a news network, variously called Infowars.com or PrisonPlanet.com, they have reporters, that's in scare quotes for anyone who wasn't looking at the time, who produce news stories, once again in scare quotes, although Alex Jones also claims he doesn't produce news, he only produces opinion. That would appear to be a legalistic trick to try and get him off certain charges of producing false information. When he makes claims about other networks producing fake news, those networks do not respond. So CNN does not respond to Alex Jones labeling its news as being fake with a news story defending itself. When Donald J. Trump makes a claim that CNN is producing fake news about his presidency, CNN feels the need to defend itself against the accusation by the president. And that's because for the accusation that's just fake news, and we're talking about the insincere accusation of that's just fake news, to have any power, typically the person making that accusation or allegation has to have some association with an institution or political power base. Not everyone gets to insincerely label news as being fake. Basically, only the powerful get away with this. So fake news accusers, like Donald Trump, although I might be putting too much intentionality into Donald Trump in this particular story, which may be a problem here, are going to be thinking this through And they're going to be thinking about people they want to persuade that some proper piece of news is actually fake news, and also how the rest of the population is going to react when they reject that appellation. And actually, this kind of comes out of the work of Joe Usinski, who's a political scientist at the University of Miami, who talks about how conspiracy theories are for losers. And his contention is, it's not that being a loser in a kind of psychological sense makes you a conspiracy theorist. His argument is that conspiracy theories are often put forward by people who have lost the political debate at a particular point in time. So one way to explain why you aren't in power is to allege a conspiracy by the other side. Trump is a bit of a confounding factor here, because Trump won the political debate, and yet seems to have a lot of conspiracy theories about how the Democrats, the deep state, the liberals, and now the deep medical state is conspiring against him. Because apparently COVID-19 is a deep medical conspiracy designed to derail Trump's presidency. So even nature conspires against President Trump now. But Joe's response is, well, I mean, yes, Trump technically won the election, but he acts like a loser. He has presented himself as someone who is besieged at all sides by his political enemies. Even though actually he has the White House and he has the Senate, he's acting like he's a leader in exile of an opposition trying to get back into power. So in the same respect, Trump is using fake news as a way of kind of leveraging that particular way of doing things by acting as if he's lost to tarnish the news about what's going wrong with his presidency as being fake news. Now, whether Trump's being sincere about that, as in he has thought this through and has done a mental calculus about doing this, or whether Trump is actually the best bullshitter the world has ever seen, which is also a distinct possibility here, we can point to other examples. So you've got Viktor Orban in Hungary, who appears to be clever in a way that Trump doesn't appear to be clever, and is using the same kind of mechanism. You've got Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, who is using the same kind of mechanisms and the same language about a deep state and fake news media being against him. These are examples of leaders who are doing a kind of calculus to go, even though I'm in power, I can weaponize the media against itself by labeling some news as being fake news, knowing that my supporters are going to go, well, that's good enough for me, and knowing that the people who react to it by going, that's just fake news, is going to harden the heart of the supporters in the first place. And that's why power is important for the way the accusation works, because power allows the allegation to end up being weaponized. So, as I say, that's something about the way that accusations of fake news work. Now we come to what I call an abrupt conclusion. The reason why I ended up writing the paper the way I did was that when Charles Pigden and Vanya Kovac put forward their talk about bullshit news, biased news, and sloppy reporting, what came to me when I was doing the rewrite of the paper is the best way to kind of distinguish between particular types of news which aren't fake news and particular types of news which are fake news is by looking at target audiences. And the realization that actually we're probably looking at more than one target audience when we talk about what counts as fake news. And we're particularly looking at more than one target audience, in-group and out-group, when we're talking about how the accusation that something is fake news, when it's insincere, tends to work. And thus, I now have two incredibly rough first draft definitions of fake news and the insincere accusation of fake news. So these are first drafts. These were literally written at 9 o'clock last night after a long 7-hour day of finishing off this paper. So if they don't read particularly well, or they seem to be insufficient for describing what I've just described in this talk, that is absolutely fine. Part of this process is getting these definitions or descriptions down and refined. But I think if we're talking about fake news, once again, we need to be thinking about not just the in-group, the people you want to persuade, but also the fact that producers of fake news and insincere accusers that something is fake news are often also thinking about the people who they want to persuade that some piece of real news is fake news, and how that sometimes they are also thinking about how people are going to react to that claim, knowing full well that they can weaponize that reaction to reinforce their claim that the real news is fake after all. And that brings us to the end of this exciting presentation on news which is fake, which may itself have been either bullshit or fake news. It's entirely up to you.